All right, so good morning and welcome to another Security Compass webinar. Today's webinar topic is security metrics. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, and our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. As you might notice, you've all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event, and you'll receive an email with a link to that recording. We'll also publish this recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A chat, and we'll address them during our Q&A session. Like I mentioned, for today's webinar, our topic is security metrics. I'm pleased to have here with me Altaz Villani, Director of Insights Research at Security Compass, Ruth G. Lennon, a lecturer in the Department of Computing in Letterkenny Institute of Technology, Ireland, and Vicky Haley, a Certified Management Consultant. Ruth, Vicky, and Altaz, thank you so much for being here with me today. I know our audience is keen to hear your presentation, so I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks a lot, Raquel. Appreciate that. And as always, please keep this open and fluid. If there are any questions that you've got, don't hesitate. We'd be more than happy to take them in flight as well. So you can put them into the chat window. You can put them into the Q&A panel. What I'm going to do real quick is spin up a whiteboard, and we're going to have a conversation today around security metrics. Now, we all understand that security metrics are important. The question before us is, how do you go about thinking when implementing security metrics? How do you align security metrics? What's important? What should you be focusing on? And as we'll discover, there are many different stakeholders that play into this. And I guess what I'd like to start off with our conversation today, maybe I'll start with you, Ruth, and just to kind of give us a sense from your perspective, what are you seeing in the industry as it pertains to security metrics?
Try again. Thank you, Altaz. What I'm finding in Ireland and a bit further afield is that people aren't really aware of what to do. They don't know what to measure. They don't know why they should measure. They're taking measurements that they find on a webinar or something else and go, okay, that's it. That's the one I need. Maybe that's the top 5. They're the 5 I need. And I don't think they're really looking at the why. Why are we measuring it? Now, I know Kelvin said something along the lines of, you can't improve it if you don't measure it. I think it was Kelvin, you can check that later. But why are we measuring it? Now, our perspectives differ. So if I'm a top-level manager in the company, I want to know that I'm getting, 1, bang for my buck, and 2, that something is happening so I don't have to worry about the big risk. But if I'm a low-level technician, security technician, just tell me exactly what you need me to measure. I don't need to make those decisions. Those decisions should be made higher up. So we're missing that bit in between about what to measure and why.
Yeah, that's a really good point, if I can jump in, Altaz.
Mm-hmm.
What it really reflects is the lack of understanding of what the business needs are, because all metrics are really, and it doesn't matter if they're security metrics or other types of metrics, they're just really, how are we doing? And how can we tell how well we're doing compared to what we think we're doing? And often exactly what Ruth was saying, there's that level of ambiguity because the processes aren't defined. People don't know what their job description really entails. They're told to do a bunch of tasks that they may not even be trained for. And even if those typical day-to-day problems aren't there, without explicitly explaining the value that these metrics bring to the business. Again, going back to what Ruth says, what are you measuring and why? Because ultimately, all metrics is a barometer in terms of where you are compared to where your goals are.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Ruth. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, yeah, that's exactly it. It's about your perspective. It's about measuring where you are now. But the size of the company is also going to make a difference to it. So as a practitioner, I might say, I want this metric right now. But I know if I'm in a bigger company, well, there are a range of metrics. And there are probably more technicians involved and maybe more resources that I can throw at it. So I can automate a lot of tasks that I might not otherwise have done. But in a very small business, you have to accept that there is limited time and you have to do the best that you can do. And that has to be an acceptable risk. You have to decide what that risk is. Who is you? Well, again, it depends on the size of the company, how many stakeholders are there, what their roles are, and what the business is. The acceptable risk for a company, a banking company, is obviously significantly different to that for a Facebook style. Yes, it's great to have. Yes, it's getting money, but I don't have somebody's wages on the line, or I'm not a hospital. I don't have somebody's life on the line. So that has to be part of it too, understanding a deeper level of why.
Mm-hmm. So let's make this concrete then. Let's talk about you brought up financial industry. You talk about banking. We've got a mid-sized banking company organization, and they want to put out a feature in their mobile app, which is going to make them more competitive in the marketplace. Walk us through now. This is a scenario. They know it is something that is important to them. So downtime is important. They need to respond quickly, but they've got to put this out in a way that's going to be secure. The question now on the table is, what's the process that we would go through in order to construct the right metrics?
Okay, the first thing we want to do is carve out some time. We need to know that there's going to be time to do a self-assessment. What kind of measures are already there? Once we find out what kind of measures are already there, and we know what time we can allocate to this, next we need to look at what risk is involved. Now, if this is a critical app and we know we're under time pressure to get it out, maybe we want to accept that there's a certain amount of risk in that, and we'll put our measures in at a lighter level, or at least understand that there's a certain amount we can do, and we need to do greater improvements in the next round of changes. So we need cyclical, and we need to improve each time. Maybe.
And adding to that, it's a matter of what exactly are you consulting and self-assessing for? So when we're talking about security, we're talking about specific attributes of the processes, their performance, what the products are supposed to do. And in security, it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And those are the primary attributes that we want all security to do. And once we get then into, well, what are the subcomponents of that? Because it's not just those. We tend to have others. Then we start to get into how we can measure, because ultimately without a process having some kind of outcome that's tangible or as an input to the next process, how do we even know that the processes are achieving their outcomes? So it's really critical that we also look at process metrics from the perspective of a process, because then we're able to look at what are these processes doing with respect to what they're supposed to do with security. For example, is it really measuring the amount of traffic that's coming in, and is it really selectively prohibiting the traffic that shouldn't get in? And what's the downtime? What's the when things are happening through a breach, what is the availability requirement? And then what are the actual performance metrics that you see based on how the processes are performing?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So when we look at it from the perspective of trying to develop a program or put something in place that tells us specifically what we're going to measure against, would you suggest, Vicky, that this is contextual by product, or do you find in your experience that this is something that there is a subset which is generic across the board and then becomes specific for each product? How does that work?
Well, if we're talking DevSecOps, we're talking about an environment that is presumably leading towards some level of automation, throughput, volume, velocity, etc. And so we're looking at creating sets of predictable processes where we're actually able to plan what we're doing. So this is going back to the fact that you can't just assume that you're able to do everything once you're out of the gate. This requires repeatability, process integrity, because ultimately automation is the culmination of that. So moving toward that level is ultimately what we're trying to do with DevSecOps, because that's a service to the rest of the organization. And unless you know what you're protecting and you understand the business processes, then how does anybody know that data is being compromised because it hasn't been associated with a particular value, for example?
And so you've got to align that to what's ultimately of value then. So let me take this one step further. So we've done step one. We've conducted a self-assessment. We understand the risk threshold. We've got our processes. We understand the performance. So where do we go from here now?
Let's look at some of the types of metrics, or at least the categories of metrics that we might want to use. So Vicky's already mentioned process as a type of metric, or as a general category for our metrics. Well, we also have network metrics, and then we have software metrics. And as a big broad category, I'm going to mention people metrics, because it's the oft forgotten metric. So starting at the top with our process metrics, maybe we want to check that we have our policies in place. And are we complying with those policies? And sometimes that can be automated, and that could make it a lot simpler if you have the time, if you have the personnel and the expertise, because these things aren't easy. And compliance to what? Well, we need to look at the standards. They vary depending on where you are, and particularly towards your business domain. So whether it's your FIPS 140 or your SP 800, they're just two NIST examples. I suppose I should pick some others, but just to give you an example, they are standards that we do apply. Now, okay, I picked those and I'm from Ireland, so why am I picking American standards? Because, okay, we still have an equivalent and we follow best practice, and they are the default best practice, so I still have to follow them, even though I'm from a different country. So we need to know what we're looking to measure on and why we're trying to measure.
Now, when we're dealing with standards then, Ruth, let me push a little bit further, because we talked a little bit about the different personas. We've got a manager and we've also got a practitioner. Now, when we talk about standards, talk to me a little bit about what does standards mean to a manager? What would standards mean to a practitioner, if any? Is there a need to do some translation here? How does that work?
I would say that in many, but not all companies, to the practitioner, the standards are that irritating thing that stops doing my job, because they get in and they have to do an audit, and that's so much time out of my way, and that means I can't progress. Really always seeing the relevance. Now, I am not talking about all companies. I'm talking about some. Whereas a manager says, okay, this is something we have to do. I don't want to know about the nitty gritty. I only want to know, are we complying with the standard? So I think we have to use the right language to talk to each of our stakeholders. So the managers need to know at the high level, are we making progress? And is that changing our risk? And is that affecting our return on investment? Now, the return on investment is obviously really hard to measure when it comes to our metrics. So if I say, for example, the number of incidents, okay, so I'm going to improve our identification of the number of incidents. Okay, but what about the number of incidents you can't identify? How do you measure something you can't identify? So it necessarily work in a nice, easy line. And we tend to summarize these things in graphics when we talk to management. And as anybody knows, when you get down to the nitty gritty, it's that one outlier in the chart that is the problem that we really want to look at. That's the bit that we're interested in. So for the practitioner, it tends to be low level. We lose that high level picture. But we're beginning to see this is a solid improvement I can make. The definitive change. Sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, so going back to your Altas, to your diagram where you have the manager and the practitioner, if you now add on the left to the manager the customer, that actually provides the perspective that ultimately is the whole purpose of what's going on. And that perspective tends to provide that additional knowledge, information, risk perspective, and understanding of context that the practitioner in their process, when they're just doing their coding, they don't understand, what am I doing here? Why am I looking for breaches against this kind of data? When it's tied to a customer, suddenly the value becomes apparent because the customer is the focus of every organization.
But sometimes if the organization is broken up, if it's quite large or a lot of divisions, sometimes it can be the case that the customer is actually another department within the company. And that's worth remembering too.
Yeah. That's interesting. So we talked here about the steps. Step one, conduct a self-assessment. And we eventually are driving towards the right risk metrics, the right security metrics that we want to have. So we've identified the risk threshold, we've done certain measurements, we've looked at automation and how we might be able to extract certain information. And the second step is we want to categorize these metrics, which deal with the process, the product, the security side, the people side. Tell me a little bit more about standards and what's the interaction between standards and this categorization, if any.
Vicky?
You're talking about the categorization of the metrics?
Yeah. Is there any play between the standard? So say someone wants to look at NIST 853 as an example. And here we've talked about we need to categorize our metrics. Can a framework or a standard help us at all with any categorization, or are they in fact quite different?
Well, in fact, if you look at, for example, something like 27001 where certification is involved,
Yep.
then that in itself is a metric. It's a binary. You either have a certification or you don't. And within that kind of a framework of a system, you have a whole series of other metrics that are going to surface, such as you've identified here. So metrics, again, are whatever is of value. And so if there's conformity to specific requirements such as standards, then a certification provides that kind of a metric. If there's a contractual requirement that there are specific service level agreements that the organization has with respect to customer data, then that agreement is going to serve as the standard for how they're going to be performing. It's a legal standard, and it's going to be broken down into whatever values are important. It might be mean time to recovery for an application. It might be the 24/7, 365 availability. And so the metrics are going to be derived from the relationship, how the applications and the data are being used, what needs to be secured, and essentially what are the requirements for both compliance and policy as well as product that need to be managed.
Yeah, all in view of keeping the customer and setting the context based on what the customer is looking for.
Exactly.
And I think that we need to remember that when we come up with these metrics, we don't go, yes, I've got my metric, that's it, mean time to recovery, number of port scans. We need to realize that this is an ongoing thing. And if we have this down in this small area, whatever our small area is, we've got our metric for that area down, we need to move on and look at the next metric. And we need to always be aware that we're not aware of the future metrics that we need to plan for, that we need a little bit of time to figure out the next step and the next step. It's always improvement. And it's not just improvement of the individual metrics, it's an improvement of the overall process. And we take these metrics, we have these measures, whatever our measures might be, what are we doing with them? Go, yes, I've got this level. Yes, but what does that mean? What's missing at the other end? And how do we change? And do we need to change, or do we need to focus? Are we getting a right number, but we're not measuring the right thing?
Yeah, that raises a really good point, because in my auditing, I have come across organizations, large, small, medium, in every domain, where they're very proud of their metrics, but then when you ask why are they collecting them, they can't tell you. They have no idea. They've either always been collecting them, or there's a process step that says so. And that just goes back to the fact that this is business information that needs to be used. So you're collecting metrics, big deal. Unless there is an infrastructure process that allows the information to be understood at the appropriate levels, including leadership, then the metrics are just going to be that, numbers. They're not going to be having any meaningful change to those process improvements that Ruth mentioned, or to the product or the customer satisfaction.
Brilliant. So that takes us down the path of making sure that the metrics that we're measuring have some value attached to them. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got conduct a self-assessment. Step 2, we're going to categorize our metrics, and as we extract the relevant metrics, we're answering the question why, which touches on value based on the context that's been set by the customer. So now we've got, you know, the categorization of the metrics. So now what do we do? What's the next step?
We need to look at the metrics and gain information from them so that we can make that process improvement. So it's a process improvement from the metrics that we're specifically looking for. We're not going to just take the metric in isolation. There are a lot of metrics, and we need to read those metrics together and say, an individual metric might be okay, not brilliant, not bad, but it's okay. But when you realize there are a series of metrics that we're failing, now we start to have an issue. We have an indication of a bigger failure to come.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point, because that's all the metrics really are, is indicators. They're points in time of where you are in today's performance based on history. So they're not going to tell you anything about tomorrow with respect to improving unless there's actions put into place. It could tell you that you could fail tomorrow, and if you don't take that action, then you can watch it happen. And that's what happens with a lot of organizations. They don't understand how to use them, how to incorporate the improvements, or how to make them into a cycle where if you don't just patch something and improve it, you have to now verify that those improvements are actually working in that environment and in fact haven't created another problem somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. So it almost comes down to like a root cause analysis of sorts, where we're trying to go in, trying to determine where things failed, why did they fail, what was the reason, and our metrics, first of all, are we measuring the right thing? And if so, what do we need to do from an improvement perspective as we start to take a look at this from a security standpoint? I think this is important when we deal with DevOps, DevSecOps, where automation is really important. And I think when we look at value, one of the questions that I want to throw on the table here is the context for the customer. Right. On the one hand, we'll have a customer saying, I want you to make sure that you're protecting security because it implies that my data, my personal data will in fact be protected, encrypted, so on and so forth. But at the same time, there's this other idea that I want to go in and I want the latest features. Right. So there's ultimately, when we take a look at the metrics that we're trying to develop, we want to make sure that it doesn't slow us down. It doesn't become a hindrance to what the business is looking for, but it is an enabler for the business. And I think we're at a tipping point now where security is deemed to be just a normal part of how we do software development, whereas historically it was perceived as something that was kind of getting in our way. But that mindset shift needs to happen in the way that we're conducting ourselves in terms of our process. And I'd just like to open that up. Are you finding the same thing, or has the idea of the creation of security metrics become a normal part of the conversation, or is it still something where security is distant and removed from core software development processes today?
What I have found is that the metrics start to inform security by design. So security becomes much more prevalent in the early design stages, because now you've got the metrics that are showing where the vulnerabilities are, where the failures are happening, and more importantly, where the business value can be lost. So yeah, it's becoming a very critical part. And again, if you don't know what to measure or what you're measuring, it doesn't have to be statistically valid to start with. Some small companies are fear that they don't have the skill sets. It is common sense. What do you need for the business to succeed, and how do you want to make that happen? And then start exercising some discipline and due diligence to make sure you're collecting your numbers, but you don't have to be a statistician.
I think it also brings the idea of ownership of the problem. We need to make more of our stakeholders feel responsible for security as they go along. So having these metrics makes them realize that, well, in fact, there are failings, and perhaps some of those failings are coming from my domain. Maybe not me specifically, but from my domain. So if I spot something, if you see an error, raise it. It's a simple issue. And that error is causing that security problem, whatever it might be. And then it's about not only owning that issue, but to make sure that you hold on to that learning and that you don't make that mistake again, or at least you make a very strong attempt not to make that mistake again, that you apply the fix. So we've optimized, yes, but we need to try and apply it for every project that we go through within that company.
Mm-hmm. So there's almost like a continuous, improvement model that you were suggesting earlier, Ruth. Once we've got the stakeholder accountability in place and we've got the right ownership, we're all collectively working together to learn from our mistakes to help us move forward. And what's interesting, if you look at DevOps, it really focused traditionally on the dev and ops environments, but it sounds to me like we're at this point, when we talk about stakeholder accountability, it extends even beyond just dev and ops. Now it's security and it's risk and some of these other teams, compliance, because we've got standards, for example. Is that in line with what you're seeing, Ruth and Vicky?
Yeah, it definitely is. I find that there's a company here in Letterkenny, and they spend all of their time trying to get companies to test their staff. Simple things. Walk up to a door with a big heavy box. If I were to do that, and I have done this test, you walk up to the door with a big heavy box, any gentleman will open the door for you. They forget that there are security controls and pin pads and everything else, because you're trying to do the right thing, because we're human. There are lots of things that we fail on a social level, and taking ownership, understanding that those metrics apply to you, and the either success or failure of the metrics also applies to you. But that brings it back around to the success. I think we look at metrics often in a negative way, and sometimes we need to find a way to celebrate, hey, you've achieved this level. You have done well in improving your security, and bring something that is a carrot to the department or to the person who has achieved that level. Give them something. Now, it doesn't have to be a monetary value. It could be, well, your project is going to follow this particular line, or maybe we'll shift your hours around to mean that you always have that 3 o'clock child pick up from school time that you've been asking for. It could be something tiny, but it makes a difference. So what is the carrot to make them say that, yes, you've succeeded, you've hit this level, well done. We don't do that enough.
Mm-hmm. So let's take this one step further, because we've talked earlier about automation. We've conducted a self-assessment, we've categorized our metrics, we've even optimized them, we've started to put in place stakeholder accountability. Where does automation fit in? When do we start to implement, when do we start to measure this stuff? Is this now the stage where we start to roll that out, or is there still something missing?
Well, it depends on the stability of the processes, because they need to be repeatable. So they have to have a certain level of maturity, if you want to call it that, or capability, in order to be able to predict that, yes, that is a repeatable performance. And once that's the case, then yes, things can get automated with the appropriate human in the loop targets. So it all depends on the context, but the metrics are going to inform, because again, while you're counting the successes, you are also putting in place metrics to count the failures to prevent them from happening. So you're looking for indicators upstream, so that once you see something going awry, you're well prepared to nip it in the bud before it progresses any further. So you're going to be counting those types of incidents as well.
Mm-hmm.
I also think if we go back to your case study, where we started off with a financial institution and they had this critical app that's going out, and they want to really start to look at security now. I think they're quite a different company or a different group, because they're looking at bringing in security now very late in the game. So at this stage, they're now looking at, okay, now I have my procedures in place. I now have checked that my procedures have worked. I have improved the process of my procedures. Now's a good time to start to automate them. However, if you looked at a company that was already implementing some levels of security, I would say the self-assessment is a continuous thing. You continuously check, you validate, you verify that everything is there as expected. That should be automated. So that should happen on a regular basis. How often is regular? Depends on the company, depends on the product, but that should be automated. So depending on the company, I'm going to say, yes, we add the automation at step 5 if you've not really done security before and you're trying to get your process established right. But for everybody else, I would say step 1.
Mm-hmm.
Try to automate until you know what that process is and you have that process fixed. Otherwise, you're going to have to keep going back and changing that in your code, in your automation processes, in your environments. That's not good. Do it manually first, understand what the process is, then automate it.
I'd like to dwell on this number 5 a little bit here. We've got it here in black and white, establish a process, establish your process stability. But when we get down to it, it implies that we're going to be having conversations with multiple people potentially on this. There may be operational folks, there may be people on the development side, we might have people on the business side involved with this. Is the goal here to reach consensus, or what's the focus? Vicky, you brought up the customer context. Is that what we use to try and galvanize and reach a consensus around the process stability and what we need to do to improve here?
That may be part of it, but ultimately the process outcomes have to be defined. What is actually that process producing, and where is it going? And does it meet its exit criteria and input criteria into the next step? So until that has been established in a repeatable way, a predictable way, where there aren't errors introducing, automation can't happen, because automation will stop every time there's an error. So you need to get the process to be error-free before you can automate it. That's the repeatable aspect of that. And then once that happens, then it's a matter of monitoring that performance, because it's not going to be operating in a vacuum. There's going to be changes in all of the areas in the environment, including new requirements that come from stakeholders. So that process of keeping that automation updated to the same level is a critical one that, again, requires performance monitoring on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah.
we look, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so that's really good. We're looking at it where, again, and the whys, and expanding it across. So far we've looked at the metrics with regard to this live system, but we haven't really looked at the metrics with regard to destroying or removing these products once they come to their end of term or end of life. And although it seems implicit, I think it's worth calling out and saying that the metrics don't just suddenly stop, or they don't just improve in that one tiny area. We need to make sure that we're looking at all areas. And if you answer me to say that, yes, you've got your company and it is applying security everywhere, I tell you, you don't know what security is, because you're not. You just can't get it everywhere all of the time. You are missing something. You have to keep looking, because there are new problems all the time. It's something we don't tend to do, is to continue to look and continue to improve the types of metrics we're doing and why we're doing those metrics.
So let me talk about life cycles then, because I believe we're talking about many different kinds of life cycles that all converge here. We've got, on the one hand, our policies, our security policies that get created here, that will help drive. Maybe they come from our standards, maybe they come from SLAs. And so there's going to be a creation of the policy. We're going to be maintaining the policy, and maybe the policy at some point is no longer valid. But we also have life cycles related to software development. We've got life cycles attached to operations, incident management, for example. Something comes in, we've got certain metrics that we're going to have around that. What's our response time? Critical in terms of what's high, medium, low from a security perspective. How do we wrap our minds around metrics with all of these various life cycles without losing ourselves? Is there a framework? Is there an approach that we could take that could help us to identify what is most important, so we don't get lost in generating so many metrics? To the point that was raised earlier, I believe Vicky brought this up, that we're measuring things, but and I think Ruth, you brought it up as well. Why are we measuring these things, right? If we take just a single life cycle approach, it may be important, but when we start to converge and put these life cycles together, then suddenly maybe it's not as important, But there are some conflicting discussions that happen there. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do we mean when we say across the life cycle?
Vicky, do you want to go?
I'm not sure if I understand your question, because you gave me about 3 of them in there. Can you just give me one to focus on?
let's start with one. So when we say that we've got to continually look at the life cycle and evaluate the metrics everywhere from creation to maintenance to possible deprecation, whether it's a product, whether it's a service, there's still security involved in that. So my question is, when we start to get multiple life cycles, which actually is a proxy for multiple stakeholders coming together, how do we identify what is then most important and relevant from the perspective of a security metric? Do we allow someone who is...
Hold on. Let me go there.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
So ultimately, security is a layered approach. So if the organization recognizes that there's going to be conflicting objectives, conflicting metrics perhaps between products or departments, ultimately security's job is to ensure that things that are supposed to be impenetrable are, irrespective of their context. So while there's business value and all of that information that drives how security is designed into the organization, its processes and its products, ultimately that has to be understood in a level that is layered for the particular context that it's designed for. So every organization has limited resources. It's not able to create exactly what it wants in all cases, because sometimes the budget is constrained or the technology doesn't even exist in order to provide those protections, in which case there has to be trade-offs and decisions made. And so it's an organizational holistic approach that has to be taken with security at the organizational level that understands where it's vulnerable, what it has to do to shore up against those vulnerabilities and threats, and ensure that that holistic and umbrella approach really wraps its arms around that whole context of security so that nothing that isn't supposed to be leaking through can happen. And once that understanding is done, then that's where you bring in tools and then there's a constant ongoing evolution of the performance of securing those product services and life cycles.
Yep, that makes sense. So if we now look at doing this across the life cycles, it's going to be layered based on certain constraints that we've got. And that brings us then back to step 5 here, where we're establishing the process stability against maturity, against the processes, the inputs, the outputs, who are the customers in the given process. At that point, once we've got this nailed down, are we in a position then to consider automation capabilities?
Yeah, you are, because now you've got a level of predictability in place where you're now able to demonstrate your compliance, your conformity to policies and standards, and you have the roles and responsibilities and the stakeholder connections are all built in now. Now you can actually start to automate and then monitor to ensure that the performance is there.
And this is what gets us to continuous security then, right? Because we automate this. We've tried to remove as much of the roadblocks that exist internally. We've got a layered approach, and we're tracking the metrics at every layer so that we can, in fact, inform the practitioners, inform the managers, inform the executives based on the level that they're looking for in terms of the security metrics. Did I get that right?
That's right, and that's happening because you're taking a systems approach. And that systems approach is, again, looking at the organization as a system with its subsystems being its products and services or whatever else. And because it's a systems approach, that enables that holism to make sure that all of the aspects have been considered and then monitored, because nobody can expect a panacea or perfection going through this. And that's why the monitoring is so critical, and that feedback loop is always there.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget that the automation code itself that we're looking at has to be secured. I think we go, okay, we've got the process, we've got the mesh. Okay, let's move ahead. And then you write a piece of code and you realize that piece of code was written so badly, there are security holes in that. That's giving away information just by the code itself. That opens up new areas. And I think as well that we need to look at the fact that those scripts need to be reviewed on a regular basis. As the process changes, so should the scripts.
And that's a really good
point. Software.
That's a really good point, because what that does is it brings in the fact that you're managing risk now on an ongoing basis. You're iterating through and you're managing those risks. We talked about that in number 1, that self-assessment. So you're looping back to ensure that you've managed those risks, and now you're controlling them in the manner that you're supposed to according to business value requirements.
Mm-hmm. And so it also provides the assurance now that, if we were to go and have a certain security metric measuring against, a certain guardrail or policy that we've created, that we are in fact adhering to that. And then subsequent to when we talk about automation, I think, Ruth, what you're pulling on here is when we talk about securing the pipelines, this is now at this stage where we start to talk about the right tools. How are we going to generate this? What tools are we going to need for automation? Are they existing tools? Do we augment with other tools? Am I right in my assumption on that?
Yeah, exactly. But I think just before you jump ahead to all of that, I want you to think about a missing step that we have, and that is to test the process of failure. We found a metric, we realized that we failed that metric, whatever it is, or maybe we've got a security breach. Where are we looking at? How do we roll back? So we need to include a step, which is that rollback phase, that we plan for it. It will happen. It's not an if, it's a when. And how do we do that securely? Because the rollback itself is open or can be open. So we want to make sure that that's secured. Then we look at specific tools. Once we have the process established, once we know what the process is, yes, we can automate that. So now let's look at the tools. And again, be aware that the tools change and the tools themselves have holes. Every time we fix something, at another area that has a hole, and maybe it's a smaller area, but we still need to keep looking. You are never done securing your system.
Yeah, and I think this is important. Once we now get down to the tooling side, it's keeping up as well, not just from the process standpoint, but looking at the tools as well. How do we ensure that the tools continue to remain secure? And it's part of the integration between the tools, but it's also ensuring that the data and the scripts and everything within the tools themselves are in fact secure as well. Well, it looks like we've got a pretty full page here. I'm going to open it up at this point to both of you. Is there anything in here that you think we have missed, or what you found to be more prevalent than other things that we've discussed?
Now I'm just looking at the list, and I'm just looking for objectives to be put in there. So that, I think, is part of the overall category of self-assessment, is determine what those objectives are. That would be a missing step there.
And a
So the categories,
organization size as well, that you can only do what you can do with the resources you have. So if your organization is smaller, you still need to step into the idea of security. You can still make that change. Obviously, a bigger organization will have whole teams of security. If you're a very small organization, it may be only you. That doesn't mean it's okay not to do security. You still have to do so.
That makes sense. Great. Well, at this point then, what I'd like to do is I'd like to hand it over to Raquel. Raquel, any questions, anything that that we need to address at this point?
Yes, let me just pull up the questions here. Quickly before we get into questions, thank you so much again. That was a great webinar. Like I mentioned before, if you haven't had a chance to submit your questions, please do so now in the Q&A chat. So some of the ones that came in here, I have the first one here. It says, who owns the responsibility for aligning security metrics?
Okay, so we talked about ownership here. Go ahead, Ruth.
Who owns the internet? Everybody. Everybody has responsibility. This is not just a small thing. If you don't get people to take ownership of their domain, of the risk that they are introducing to the company, then of course we're not going to have security overall. You can have the best security team in the world, but if you have one person in that company writing their password on a yellow sticky note underneath their laptop, it's still going to be insecure. Or jamming the door of the office open with a bin because it gets hot in the day. I've seen this. I've seen them opening a data center and jamming a bin in it and walking away so that they've got more air into the data center. And you go, that keypad is a waste when you've got the door wide open. Everybody has to be responsible for part of that security. Everybody.
Vicky, any thoughts?
Oh, no, I think Ruth said it beautifully. Security is everybody's responsibility, and that means making sure that you know whether or not you're secure, and that's where the metrics come in to help.
Yeah, I was going to go there with that as well. I was going to suggest that, you know, even though it's like everybody gets involved, it doesn't mean that we do it in a way where suddenly nobody is ultimately responsible, but there are some clear metrics and clear measurements that we put in place to get everybody to really make sure. And this is part of the layered approach that we were talking about earlier as well. Raquel?
Perfect. The next question we have here is, does this assume that metrics will remain constant? What if they're continually shifting?
Okay, I've seen this. Yeah, go ahead, Vicky.
I was going to say they should shift as objectives change, as performance levels change, as you get, as Ruth was saying, it's a matter of managing resources. So if you're already doing really well in a particular area, you can redeploy those measurement resources into something else. It all takes cost of effort, time, maintenance, and so on. So it's not a bottomless pit. It takes time and effort and resources to measure. So absolutely, they should evolve according to the context and the needs of the business.
Yeah, I agree. And there's some real use cases of that right now where we talk about organizations going digital. For example, it's having them rethink how they do some of their work from a security perspective. You know, we've had a pandemic. People are now working remotely. That's another use case of how some of these things begin to emerge. And so we're really, you know, if we look at this being static, I think is the wrong approach to take. We should anticipate that things will change, but the goal is to have the right structure, the right governance, the right process so that we can continually improve and shift and change as we need to.
Exactly, and that actually brings up the aspect that it's not just risk management, but it's risk management of emerging risks, which the knowledge around those risks is largely unknown. So unless you're constantly monitoring and understanding what could be coming down the pipeline, you could be caught short. Emerging risks, there's a new standard coming out, ISO 31050, and it addresses the fact that how do you go through a risk management process without having full knowledge of what you're supposed to risk manage? And that's where the stakeholder involvement, the outreach, and the projection and the monitoring really has to come into play, because then you're on the alert for these emerging risks as they evolve.
Perfect. And the last question that we got here is, my systems aren't integrated. How do I achieve this alignment?
Okay, I've got some thoughts on that, but I'll let the two of you take a crack at that.
I think you need a bit more clarity on that. Your systems aren't in alignment. And what is the second half of that, Raquel?
How do I achieve it? The first one was, my systems aren't integrated. How do I achieve this alignment?
Okay. It very much depends on what types of systems you have. And we didn't actually talk about observability and monitoring and such systems, but we do need to start aligning them up with regard to time and what are the domains and how those domains impact on each other, and whether you're, as a stakeholder, whether you need just simple knowledge of a change, or whether you actually are going to be solidly impacted by that change. Going back to the graphic that was drawn earlier on, you need to do the audit. You need to really see where those interconnections are, because you might find that there are interconnections, but maybe the processes are manual, so you don't see that they're integrated, but there's a lot going on that's happening in the background.
Yeah, and I think go ahead, Vicky.
No, I was just going to agree with Ruth that it depends. If your systems aren't integrated, maybe there's a reason for that. Often, corporate knowledge is often very short, and so people tend to inherit jobs with system histories that they're not aware of. And there may be a very good reason why they're not integrated. So understanding, going through the assessment, and looking at the purpose of the system, how it's been deployed, and why it is as it is, will help inform whether or not there should be a change. And that's always necessary. People think that change management is something that is always the option. And again, just like anything else, it needs to be controlled and planned for. Yeah.
So to me, when I heard that question as well, the thing that got into my mind was The tooling side of it comes after you've gone through the analysis, looked at where you are today, what's the context, what's important, and then only after that, looking at ways that you might be able to integrate. And if it turns out that your systems cannot be integrated, then are there other ways through which you can achieve that? And this conversation needs to be done by dealing with multiple stakeholders. The systems represent the processes that these stakeholders are using, and there may be valid reasons why some of that cannot be stitched together. So that would be the approach that I would take. Just because one organization has a certain set of security metrics does not imply that that is what you should be using. Instead, my suggestion would be focus on a process that you can lean on to help you derive what is most important contextually for your organization.
Just to add to what was said earlier by Vicky, is to find out what has changed that makes you think you want to integrate now, because maybe there was a reason, or maybe it is integrated and you don't realize. What is that big change that makes you think, yes, I need to integrate now? Because that is going to give you direction as to how this process is going to be played out.
Awesome. Well, that was it for the questions that were submitted. So thank you so much again, Altaz, Ruth, and Vicky, for another great session. Just to let everybody know, we do have webinars lined up for the next few weeks. So if you are interested in attending any of these, please go to the events and webinar section of our website to sign up. Also, if you haven't heard, we've officially launched our podcast, The Balancing Act, and you may actually recognize a few voices on there. So please make sure to check us out on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We hope that everyone found this presentation insightful. And again, we will provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone here via email. Thank you so much again for attending, and have a